So here's the thing about galactic military intelligence. It's neither galactic, nor military, nor intelligent. Case in point, the Zephyrian High Command's brilliant tactical assessment that went something like this. It's just one human. How dangerous could he possibly be? Spoiler alert, very, very dangerous. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and explain how the most technologically advanced military coalition in 3 spiral arms managed to turn what should have been a routine prisoner transport into the galaxy's most expensive demonstration of why you never, ever underestimate a species that figured out how to split atoms before they figured out how to get along with each other. Chapter 1. The Assessment. The war room aboard the Zephyrian flagship Inevitable Conquest. And yes, they actually named their ships things like that, because subtlety died alongside their sense of humor approximately 3 millennia ago. Buzzed with the kind of nervous energy you'd expect from military officers who'd just been handed an assignment that made about as much sense as a chocolate teapot. Admiral Klekstar stood before the holographic display, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the harsh blue light. Around him, representatives from a dozen different species fidgeted in ways that would have been comical if they weren't all armed to their various appendages with enough firepower to glass a small moon. "Gentle beings," Klekstar began, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else. "We have been tasked with the retrieval of one human prisoner from the mining colony of Kepler 442b. A collective murmur rippled through the assembled officers. The Thraxian delegate, a towering insectoid whose species had perfected the art of looking perpetually concerned, raised what might generously be called a hand. "Admiral, forgive my ignorance, but one human?" "One human," Klekstar confirmed, and you could practically hear the collective sigh of relief. After all, how hard could it be? The hologram flickered to life, displaying what looked like a fairly standard bipedal mammalian creature. Nothing particularly impressive about him. Average height, brown hair that clearly hadn't seen a proper grooming in weeks, and the kind of stubble that suggested either a recent escape or a complete disregard for military grooming standards. "Probably both. Subject designation, Alex Reeves," Klekstar continued. "Former Terran Coalition Special Operations. Captured 3 standard weeks ago during a reconnaissance mission that went sideways." Sideways was military speak for catastrophically wrong, which in this case meant that Alex's insertion team had been ambushed, his squad eliminated, and he'd somehow fought his way through 2 battalions of Zephyrian shock troops before finally being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Minor details like that tended to get glossed over in official reports. "Intelligence suggests he has information regarding Terran defensive capabilities that could prove valuable to our ongoing negotiations." More military speak. Ongoing negotiations meant shooting war, and everyone in the room knew it. The Terrans had been giving them fits for the better part of a year now, and the High Command was getting desperate for any edge they could find. Commander Vorthak, a crystalline being whose species communicated primarily through harmonic resonance, chimed in with a sound like breaking glass. The universal translator helpfully converted this to, "Sir, might I ask why we're deploying 50 vessels for a single prisoner retrieval?" Excellent question. The kind of question that, in a reasonable universe, might have led to someone reconsidering the whole operation. Unfortunately, they weren't living in a reasonable universe. They were living in the kind of universe where military bureaucracy had achieved sentience and decided that the appropriate response to every problem was more ships. The High Command has determined that, given the subject's background and the strategic importance of this intelligence, a show of force is warranted, Klekstar replied, which was Admiral speak for "I don't know either." But orders are orders. What they didn't mention in the briefing, what wasn't in the files, because it had been classified above their considerable pay grades, was that Alex Reeves wasn't just any special operations veteran. He was the Alex Reeves, the one who'd somehow managed to extract himself from the siege of Proxima Station by convincing an entire hegemony fleet that his single-person scout ship was actually a dreadnought in stealth mode. The same Alex Reeves who disappeared into the Veil Nebula for 6 months and emerged with intelligence that had led to the liberation of the Antares colonies. The same Alex Reeves who, according to a report that exactly 3 beings in the galaxy were cleared to read, had once jury-rigged a mining laser, 2 atmospheric processors, and a malfunctioning reactor coolant system into something that the intelligence analysts were still trying to classify. They'd settled on calling it a strategic deterrent, which was bureaucratic speak for "we have no idea what it does, but it scares us." But the assembled officers didn't know any of that. They just saw a single human on a mining colony, surrounded by enough firepower to conquer a solar system. What could possibly go wrong? Chapter 2. The Prisoner. Meanwhile, approximately 3 light hours away on the delightfully misnamed Paradise mining colony, Alex Reeves was having what you might charitably call a bad day. He'd been having a lot of those lately, ever since his extraction mission had gone from routine intelligence gathering to shooting his way through half the Zephyrian Third Fleet in the span of about 15 minutes. The cell they'd stuck him in was adequate. 4 meters by 3, solid durasteel walls, a sleeping platform that had clearly been designed by someone who'd never actually seen a human spine, and a waste disposal unit that made sounds like a dying walrus every time he used it. The lighting was the particular shade of blue that suggested his captors had done their research on human psychology and had decided that mild discomfort was the way to go. They were right, unfortunately. The lighting was just annoying enough to make him want to punch something, but not quite annoying enough to justify the effort it would take to disable it. It was the kind of passive-aggressive torture that spoke to a civilization that had perfected bureaucracy before they'd invented warfare. Alex sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, methodically working his way through a series of exercises designed to keep both his body and mind sharp. Push-ups, sit-ups, and what he liked to call scenario planning, which was a polite way of saying figuring out how to kill everyone within a 50-kilometer radius, using only the contents of his prison cell. It was a surprisingly robust list. The door chimed, a pleasant musical sound that was absolutely nothing like the harsh buzzers you'd expect from a prison. More evidence that his captors were the sort of people who'd probably apologize while executing you for treason. The food slot opened with a soft hiss, and a tray slid through. Protein paste, reconstituted vegetables, and something that might have been fruit if you squinted at it from the right angle. Standard prison fare, and actually better than some of the MREs he'd choked down during his military career. At least this didn't come with a warning label about potential side effects including, but not limited to, explosive decompression of the digestive tract. He ate methodically. Not because he was particularly hungry, but because maintaining his strength was priority 1. Priority 2 was getting out of here before whatever was in that approaching fleet arrived to collect him. Because Alex had spent the last 3 weeks listening to his guards chatter in their various languages, and he'd picked up enough to know that something big was coming. 50 ships, according to the rumors. 50 ships for 1 human. Alex had to admit he was almost flattered. Almost. The thing was, 50 ships meant they were either taking him very seriously, or they were very, very bad at math. Given what he'd seen of Zephyrian military doctrine, which seemed to consist primarily of throw more ships at it until it stops moving, he was betting on the latter. Still, 50 ships was 50 more ships than he particularly wanted to deal with, which meant he needed to be somewhere else when they arrived. He finished his meal and settled back on the sleeping platform, closing his eyes and letting his mind wander through the various possibilities. The mining colony's layout, guard rotations, security systems, available resources. Most people would have called it planning. Alex called it Tuesday. The colony had been built around a massive excavation site, with the administrative and residential areas carved directly into the asteroid's rocky surface. Efficient, defensible, and absolutely riddled with structural weak points if you knew where to look. And Alex, thanks to 3 weeks of very careful observation and occasional conversations with guards who thought he didn't speak their language, knew exactly where to look. The power grid was centralized, one main reactor feeding everything through a distribution network that had clearly been designed by the lowest bidder. The life support systems were hardened against external attack but surprisingly vulnerable to internal sabotage. And the communications array was positioned in such a way that a controlled explosion in just the right place would not only knock out their ability to call for help, but would also trigger a cascade failure in the primary structural supports. In other words, it was exactly the kind of facility that looked impregnable from the outside, and turned into a death trap the moment someone with the right kind of knowledge started poking at the foundations. Alex smiled. It wasn't a particularly nice smile, but then again he wasn't feeling particularly nice. 50 ships. They were really going all out. Time to show them why that might not have been their brightest idea. Chapter 3. The Arrival. The Zephyrian fleet dropped out of hyperspace with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. 50 vessels, ranging from sleek destroyers to massive dreadnoughts, arranged in a formation that looked impressive and tactical, but was actually just expensive. Admiral Kleckstar stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the mining colony grow larger on the main screen. It looked peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where absolutely nothing interesting ever happened, which should have been his first clue that something was about to go very, very wrong. "Colony is responding to our hails, Admiral," reported his communications officer. a Vorthak whose crystalline structure had been shaped into something roughly approximating military bearing. They acknowledge our authority and request permission to begin prisoner transfer. Granted. Deploy security teams to oversee the operation. I want this done by the book. Which book, exactly, he didn't specify, but everyone understood the general idea. Overwhelming force, complete redundancy, and enough documentation to satisfy even the most pedantic bureaucrat in the high command. They were here to collect one human, and by all the gods of all the species represented in this fleet, they were going to collect him properly. The first shuttles launched from the hangar bays, loaded with enough armed troops to occupy a small city. Not because they expected resistance. The colony's defense grid consisted of exactly 4 automated turrets and a communications array that probably couldn't punch through a paper bag, but because the manual said that prisoner transfers required a minimum security complement, and the High Command had apparently decided that the minimum security complement for one human was roughly equivalent to an invasion force. Alex watched the shuttles approach through the small porthole in his cell. 10 shuttles, each carrying what looked like a full squad of soldiers. He counted approximately 120 troops, plus support personnel, plus whatever was manning the ships still in orbit. Someone was definitely overcompensating. The colony's administrator, a nervous little Zephyrian named Klotch, who'd spent the last 3 weeks treating Alex like he might spontaneously combust, was practically vibrating with anxiety as he led the security team through the corridors toward the detention block. He's been cooperative, Klotch was explaining to the squad leader. A hulking Brutok warrior whose idea of subtle interrogation probably involved very large hammers. No escape attempts, no violence against the guards. Almost disappointingly well-behaved for a human. The squad leader grunted something that might have been acknowledgement or indigestion. It was hard to tell with Brutaks. They reached the detention block, and Klotch input his authorization code with the kind of trembling fingers that suggested he was expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. The cell door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing nothing. Well, not nothing exactly. There was the sleeping platform, the waste disposal unit, the food tray neatly stacked in the corner, but no human. The squad leader stepped into the cell, weapon raised, scanning for any sign of their target. The walls were solid durasteel, no obvious escape routes. The ventilation grate was intact, still sealed with its original manufacturer's bolts. The waste disposal unit was too small for even a human child to crawl through. It was impossible. The cell was completely secure, monitored by 3 independent sensor systems, and guarded around the clock. There was literally no way for a prisoner to escape, which was when the lights went out. Chapter 4. The introduction emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in that lovely shade of red that universal translators somehow always manage to interpret as imminent doom. The colony's PA system crackled to life, carrying a voice that was definitely human, definitely amused, and definitely not coming from inside a prison cell. Good afternoon, gentle beings. This is Alex Reeves, your recently departed prisoner, speaking to you from an undisclosed location somewhere within this facility. On the bridge of the inevitable conquest, Admiral Klextar felt his exoskeleton begin to itch, which was a sure sign that his day was about to get significantly worse. Now I know what you're thinking, Alex's voice continued, with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he was having a perfectly normal conversation and hadn't just vanished from a maximum security cell. How did one human manage to escape from what I'm sure you all considered to be an absolutely impregnable detention facility? The answer is surprisingly simple. You built your entire security system around keeping people out, not keeping them in. The squad leader in the empty cell was frantically checking his equipment, trying to trace the signal. His communications specialist was doing something with a portable scanner that involved a lot of beeping and very little actual information. See, the thing about being a prisoner, Alex continued, is that you have a lot of time to observe. Guard rotations, maintenance schedules, structural engineering. Did you know that this entire facility is held together by a series of load-bearing supports that run directly through the ventilation system? Fascinating design choice. Very efficient. Also completely catastrophic if someone were to, say, introduce a resonance cascade failure at just the right frequency. Admiral Klextar's day officially became worse. I'm sure you're wondering what I want. The answer is simple. I want to go home. Unfortunately, you've brought 50 warships to what should have been a perfectly straightforward prisoner exchange, which suggests to me that you're not particularly interested in reasonable solutions. On the colony, emergency klaxons were beginning to sound as the various automated systems detected what they could only classify as structural anomalies. The kind of structural anomalies that typically preceded very expensive insurance claims. So here's my counter-proposal, Alex continued, and you could practically hear the smile in his voice. You have approximately 10 minutes to withdraw your forces to a safe distance before this facility experiences what the technical manuals probably refer to as catastrophic decompression. I, of course, will be long gone by then, but I thought I should give you fair warning. Professional courtesy and all that. The communications officer on the flagship was frantically trying to establish contact with the security teams on the surface. Half of them weren't responding. The other half were reporting various combinations of equipment failures, structural collapses, and what one particularly eloquent Brutak warrior described as, "Everything's on fire and I don't know why." Oh, and Admiral Klekstar? Yes, I know who you are. Zephyrian 7th Fleet, veteran of the Andorian campaign, recipient of the Star of Military Excellence. Impressive record. You might want to update your personnel files, though. They're surprisingly easy to access if you know where to look. Klekstar's exoskeleton was now itching so badly he was considering molt procedures, which was not a good sign for anyone involved. 9 minutes, by the way. I'd start moving those ships if I were you. Chapter 5. The Education. What followed was approximately 9 minutes of the most educational military exercise in recent galactic history. Educational in the sense that it taught several hundred highly trained military professionals exactly how much they didn't know about human military doctrine. The first lesson came courtesy of the colony's power grid, which began experiencing what the automated systems cheerfully reported as sequential overload cascades. To anyone not versed in engineering terminology, this translated roughly to, everything important is breaking in exactly the wrong order. The lights went out. Then the gravity generator started fluctuating. Then the atmospheric processors began making sounds like wounded animals, which was concerning for a variety of reasons, not least of which was that atmospheric processors weren't supposed to make any sounds at all. Squad Alpha, the team that had been sent to secure the detention block, found themselves trapped in a corridor that had somehow become a vertical shaft. The artificial gravity had apparently decided that down was now sideways, which made movement interesting and radio communication nearly impossible. Squad Beta, tasked with securing the main reactor, discovered that the reactor chamber had been sealed by emergency blast doors that no one seemed able to open. This would have been merely inconvenient if not for the fact that someone had apparently convinced the reactor's control systems that they were experiencing a containment breach, which meant the automatic systems were now attempting to implement emergency shutdown procedures. Squad Gamma got lost. This was particularly embarrassing, because the colony's layout was both simple and clearly marked. But somehow every corridor they entered seemed to lead to a different corridor than the one indicated on their maps. They spent 20 minutes trying to reach the communications center and somehow ended up in what appeared to be a cafeteria, where the automated food service systems had apparently achieved sentience and were now preparing meals for no one in particular. The remaining squads were dealing with their own various crises, ranging from malfunctioning equipment to structural collapses, to what one particularly unlucky team reported as, "The walls are bleeding." This turned out to be hydraulic fluid from the colony's environmental systems, but it was still unsettling. Admiral Klekstar watched the tactical display with the kind of growing horror typically reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. His tactical officer was providing updates that sounded increasingly like excerpts from a particularly dark comedy. "Sir, Squad Alpha reports they're experiencing localized gravity fluctuations. Squad Beta is trapped in the reactor chamber. Squad Gamma has, apparently, discovered the cafeteria. Squad Delta is requesting immediate medical evacuation for what they describe as acute disorientation syndrome." What the hell is acute disorientation syndrome? Unknown, sir. They claim the corridors keep changing direction when they're not looking. Klekstar closed his eyes and tried to remember why he'd ever thought a military career was a good idea. It wasn't working. "Sir," his communications officer chimed in, "we're receiving another transmission from the human. Put it through." Alex's voice filled the bridge again, still carrying that tone of polite amusement that was becoming increasingly irritating. 5 minutes remaining, Admiral. I hope your people are finding their tour of the facility educational. I've taken the liberty of adjusting some of the environmental systems to provide a more immersive experience. "Reeves!" Klekstar barked. "This is Admiral Klekstar of the Zephyrian 7th Fleet. I demand that you cease this sabotage immediately and surrender yourself to our custody." There was a pause, and then something that might have been laughter. "Demand? Admiral, you seem to be operating under the mistaken impression that you're in a position to make demands. Let me clarify the current tactical situation for you." The main display flickered, and suddenly they were looking at what appeared to be a three-dimensional schematic of the mining colony. Red indicators were blinking throughout the structure, each one representing a different system failure. Your ground forces are currently trapped in a facility that is experiencing cascading system failures across 17 different critical systems. The structural integrity of the main excavation chamber has been compromised. The power grid is operating at 30% capacity and dropping. The atmospheric processors are attempting to maintain life support for approximately 4 times their designed load, which means you have maybe 20 minutes before carbon dioxide poisoning becomes a serious concern for your people. More red lights began blinking on the schematic. Meanwhile, I am currently sitting in a stolen maintenance pod approximately 2 kilometers beneath the colony's main level, in a section of the mining complex that your orbital scans didn't detect because it's shielded by approximately 50 meters of solid rock and advanced sensor-dampening materials that I'm sure your intelligence people would find fascinating under different circumstances. Klekstar stared at the display, trying to process what he was seeing. The human had somehow gained access to systems that should have been completely isolated from each other, mapped the entire facility in detail, and turned what should have been a simple prisoner retrieval into a 3-dimensional chess game where all the pieces were on fire. 3 minutes, Admiral. I suggest you start moving those ships. Chapter 6. The Demonstration. What Admiral Klekstar should have done at this point was order an immediate withdrawal, evacuate his ground forces, and report back to High Command that the situation had become what military analysts like to call non-standard. What he actually did was double down, because if there's one thing that military bureaucracy teaches you, it's that admitting you might be wrong is far worse than being catastrophically wrong. All ships, this is the Admiral. Implement Containment Protocol 7. I want a complete sensor sweep of this entire asteroid. Find him. Containment Protocol 7 involved surrounding the target with overlapping sensor grids, then systematically scanning every cubic meter until you found what you were looking for. It was thorough, methodical, and completely effective against anyone who didn't understand how sensor arrays worked. Unfortunately for Admiral Klekstar, Alex understood how sensor arrays worked. He understood them very well. The mining pod he'd borrowed was exactly where he'd said it was. 2 kilometers down, in a section of the asteroid that had been carved out by automated mining equipment and then abandoned when the ore veins ran dry. The tunnels formed a complex 3-dimensional maze that extended for kilometers in every direction, most of it uncharted and unmonitored. Alex sat in the pod's pilot seat, watching the sensor readings on his commandeered display screens. The Zephyrian ships were deploying their scanning arrays in a textbook formation, creating overlapping detection fields that should have been able to locate a single human even in the middle of an asteroid field. Should have been. The problem with sensor arrays was that they worked by detecting energy signatures, mass distributions, and electromagnetic anomalies. They were very good at finding things that were trying to hide. They were somewhat less effective against things that were actively trying to be found, but not where they expected. Alex activated the mining pod's communication system and began broadcasting a signal on a frequency that he knew the Zephyrian sensors would detect. A nice, strong electromagnetic signature that screamed human life signs to anyone who was looking for them. The signal was coming from a location approximately 500 meters above his actual position, in a section of the mining complex that just happened to be directly beneath the colony's main power reactor. 30 seconds later, he watched with satisfaction as a squadron of Zephyrian fighters began moving into attack position above the bogus signal location. "Admiral," he broadcast, "I'm impressed. Your people certainly don't give up easily. Unfortunately, they also don't seem to learn from their mistakes." On the flagship's bridge, the tactical display was showing a cluster of red dots converging on what the sensors insisted was Alex's location. Klekstar felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, they were getting somewhere. "Target acquired, sir," reported his tactical officer. "Strong human life signs, approximately 500 meters below the colony's main level." "Excellent. Order the strike teams to—" "Sir," his sensor operator interrupted. "I'm reading massive power fluctuations from the colony's main reactor. Something's wrong." Alex's voice came through the comm system again, and this time he sounded almost apologetic. "I'm afraid you've been misdirected, Admiral. The signal your sensors are tracking isn't coming from me. It's coming from a modified emergency beacon that I've rigged to the colony's primary power coupling. You know, the one that's currently channeling approximately 50 terawatts of energy directly into the asteroid's primary structural matrix." Klekstar felt his exoskeleton begin to molt, which was not supposed to be possible under stress. His tactical display was now showing power readings that didn't make sense, sensor readings that contradicted each other, and what appeared to be a countdown timer that definitely hadn't been there before. "The good news," Alex continued, "is that you've successfully located the beacon. The bad news is that any attempt to extract it will result in what the technical specifications refer to as immediate and catastrophic energy discharge. In layman's terms, the entire colony will explode with roughly the force of a small star going supernova. The countdown timer on the display read 0147, 0146, 0145. I'm currently safely outside the blast radius, of course. Your people. Well, let's just say that this would be an excellent time for them to be somewhere else. Admiral Klekstar stared at the display for exactly 3 seconds, which was all the time his military training allowed him to spend processing the fact that he'd just been outmaneuvered by a single human using mining equipment and what appeared to be an excessive knowledge of power grid engineering.
All ships, emergency withdrawal. Evacuation protocol now.
Chapter 7. The Retreat. What followed was the most expensive military retreat in the recorded history of the galaxy. 50 warships, representing the combined military might of a dozen different species, fleeing from one human who was somewhere in a stolen mining pod, and apparently having the time of his life. The evacuation shuttles launched from the colony in a pattern that looked suspiciously like panic, loaded with security teams who were experiencing various combinations of equipment failure, structural disorientation, and what the medical officers were classifying as acute tactical confusion. Squad Gamma was still lost in the cafeteria. Squad Alpha had eventually figured out which way was down, but only after spending 15 minutes walking on the ceiling. Squad Beta had been extracted from the reactor chamber, but they kept insisting that the walls had been trying to communicate with them. Alex watched the evacuation from his position deep in the mining complex, using the colony's own security cameras to monitor the withdrawal. It was almost artistic in its chaos. Shuttles launching at irregular intervals, ships breaking formation to avoid imaginary obstacles, and what appeared to be an entire destroyer trying to execute evasive maneuvers against an asteroid that was just sitting there. The countdown timer reached 0 and absolutely nothing happened. This was because there had never been any explosive device connected to the power coupling. There had been an emergency beacon, exactly as Alex had said, but it was the kind of emergency beacon that you might use to call for help if your mining pod broke down, not the kind that was rigged to detonate half an asteroid. The power fluctuations had been real, but they were the result of Alex temporarily overloading the colony's systems through some creative rewiring, not because the reactor was about to explode. The catastrophic energy discharge that he'd warned about was actually just the colony's automatic circuit breakers doing their job and shutting everything down before any actual damage occurred. In other words, Alex had convinced an entire fleet to retreat from a mining colony by threatening them with an explosion that existed primarily in their collective imagination. He had to admit he was impressed with himself. On the bridge of the inevitable conquest, Admiral Klekstar was having what psychologists would probably classify as an educational moment. The kind of moment that makes you question your career choices, your understanding of military doctrine, and whether the universe might actually have a sense of humor after all. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "all ground teams have been successfully evacuated. We're showing no immediate signs of explosion from the colony." "Of course we're not," Klekstar muttered. "Status report. All ships have withdrawn to safe distance. No casualties, but we're reporting significant equipment damage across all teams. Medical is requesting permission to classify this as a training exercise for insurance purposes." "Denied. This goes in the official logs as what it is, a complete tactical failure." "Sir?" "You heard me. One human, using mining equipment and jury-rigged electronics, just forced the withdrawal of 50 military vessels through nothing more than superior knowledge of engineering principles and an apparently pathological understanding of psychological warfare." Klekstar looked at the tactical display, which was now showing the colony as a peaceful dot of light against the asteroid's rocky surface. No explosions, no structural collapse, no indication that anything particularly dramatic had happened there. "Sir?" the sensor operator called out. "We're receiving another transmission from the human." "Put it through." Alex's voice filled the bridge one more time, but now he sounded tired. Professional but tired. "Admiral, I want you to know that I have nothing but respect for your people's dedication and professionalism. Your ground teams performed exactly as they were trained to perform, and your tactical responses were textbook examples of proper military doctrine." "Then why?" "Because proper military doctrine assumes that your opponent is going to follow the same rules you are." "I'm not a military unit, Admiral. I'm not even really a soldier anymore. I'm just one human who's very tired, very far from home, and really doesn't want to spend the rest of his life in a prison cell." There was a pause. "I'm uploading the schematics for the modifications I made to the colony's systems. Your engineers will find them educational. I'm also including a complete tactical analysis of what I did and why it worked. Consider it a professional courtesy." The data started flowing across the display. Technical diagrams, system modifications, and what appeared to be a comprehensive guide to turning civilian infrastructure into military assets using nothing but spare parts and basic engineering knowledge. "I'm going to leave now," Alex continued. "I suggest you let me go. Not because I'm threatening you, I'm not, but because the next time someone sends 50 ships to capture one human, that human might not be as interested in avoiding casualties as I am." Chapter 8. The Departure. Alex powered up the mining pod's engines and began moving through the tunnel system toward one of the smaller exits on the far side of the asteroid. The pod wasn't particularly fast, but it was small enough to navigate the narrow passages that the larger ships couldn't follow, and it was shielded well enough to avoid detection by anything short of a dedicated sensor sweep. Behind him, the colony's systems were slowly coming back online as the automatic repair protocols restored power to the various sections. In a few hours, everything would be back to normal, and the only evidence of his escape would be some confused security recordings and a handful of engineering modifications that would probably be studied in military academies for the next decade. He'd managed to download a considerable amount of tactical intelligence during his 3 weeks in captivity. Fleet positions, defensive strategies, command structures, information that would be valuable to the Terran coalition, assuming he could get it to them. But more importantly, he demonstrated something that no amount of intelligence data could convey: that human military doctrine was fundamentally different from anything the galactic community had encountered before. Most species approached warfare as a logical extension of their natural social behaviors. The Zephyrians favored overwhelming force and rigid hierarchy. The Brutax relied on individual combat prowess and personal honor. The Thraxians preferred complex strategies executed through coordinated swarm tactics. Humans, on the other hand, approached warfare the same way they approached everything else, by figuring out how the rules worked and then breaking them in creative ways. The mining pod reached the exit tunnel, and Alex paused to check his sensors one more time. The Zephyrian fleet was maintaining position at what they considered a safe distance, presumably waiting to see if the colony actually was going to explode. They'd be waiting for a while. He activated the pod's communication system one last time.
This is Alex Reeves, broadcasting on all frequencies.
To Admiral Klekstar and the crews of the Zephyrian 7th Fleet, thank you for an educational afternoon. To the staff of Paradise Mining Colony, I apologize for the inconvenience, and I've left detailed instructions for reversing all system modifications in your maintenance database. To anyone else who might be listening, sometimes the best way to win a fight is to convince everyone involved that there's no point in fighting. He cut the transmission and launched the mining pod into space, using the asteroid's gravity well to slingshot toward the outer system. The pod's navigation systems weren't sophisticated enough for interstellar travel, but there was a Terran coalition listening post approximately 6 light hours away that would be very interested in both his intelligence data and his recent experiences. Behind him, 50 of the galaxy's most advanced warships continued their strategic withdrawal from one human who had just demonstrated that military superiority wasn't just about having the biggest guns or the most ships. Sometimes it was about understanding that your opponent's greatest strength could also be their greatest weakness, and that the most effective weapon in any arsenal was the ability to think differently than everyone else expected. Epilogue. The Report. 3 weeks later, Admiral Klekstar sat in his private quarters aboard the inevitable Conquest, staring at the official incident report that he was supposed to submit to High Command. The document was 17 pages long, detailed every aspect of what the bureaucrats would probably classify as Operation Successful Prisoner Retrieval, and would almost certainly result in his early retirement. The facts were simple enough. They had deployed 50 ships to capture one human. They had located the human. They had surrounded the facility where he was being held. They had deployed over 100 ground troops to secure the target. And then they had retreated because the human had convinced them that he was going to blow up an asteroid using mining equipment and a deliberately misleading countdown timer. When you wrote it out like that, it sounded like the setup to a joke that no one in the High Command would find particularly funny. The really frustrating part was that Alex had been absolutely correct in his tactical analysis. Every move the Zephyrian fleet had made had been by the book, textbook examples of proper military procedure, and every single one of those moves had played directly into his hands, because he had been counting on them to follow proper military procedure. He'd turned their own training against them, used their adherence to doctrine as a weapon, and demonstrated that sometimes the most sophisticated military strategies could be defeated by someone who understood the rules well enough to break them creatively. The technical specifications that Alex had uploaded were already being studied by military engineers throughout the fleet. His improvised modifications to the colony's systems were being dissected, analyzed, and reluctantly admired by beings whose entire careers had been built on the assumption that military technology was too complex for improvisation. Alex had proven them wrong using spare parts and basic physics. Klekstar's door chimed, and his aide entered with the kind of expression that suggested more bad news was incoming. Sir, High Command is requesting a real-time briefing on the prisoner retrieval operation. When? Now, sir. Klekstar sighed and activated his personal communication console. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the stern faces of 5 High Command officials, who looked exactly as pleased as he'd expected them to look. Admiral Klekstar, began Fleet Marshal Corinth, whose species had evolved from something that looked like an angry geometric theorem. We've received your preliminary report on Operation Successful Prisoner Retrieval. The way she said it made it clear that the operation's name was already being reconsidered. Yes, Marshal. As you can see from the documentation. Admiral, interrupted another official. Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly. You deployed 50 vessels, including 2 dreadnoughts and a heavy carrier, to retrieve 1 human prisoner from a mining colony. That's correct. And the human escaped. Yes. Using mining equipment. Among other things, yes. And convinced your entire fleet to withdraw by threatening to detonate an explosive device that didn't actually exist. Klekstar considered his response carefully. There were several ways to phrase what had happened, ranging from catastrophic intelligence failure to unprecedented tactical innovation by hostile forces. None of them were likely to result in promotion opportunities. The human demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and infrastructure manipulation that exceeded our operational parameters. He bluffed you. Yes. Fleet Marshal Corinth leaned forward, her geometric features shifting in what might have been concentration or indigestion. Admiral, in your professional opinion, how significant is this intelligence breach? Another excellent question that Klekstar had been hoping to avoid. Alex Reeves had demonstrated capabilities that no human should have possessed, using techniques that weren't in any military database, and had apparently been operating undercover identities that their intelligence services hadn't even suspected existed. Marshal, I believe we may have significantly underestimated human military capabilities. Explain. The prisoner, Alex Reeves, wasn't just a special operations veteran. Based on his performance during the escape, his knowledge of our systems, and his tactical responses, I believe he represents a level of human military development that our intelligence services haven't encountered before. You're suggesting that one human represents a new category of threat? I'm suggesting that if the Terrans have more individuals with similar capabilities, our current strategic assessments may be incomplete. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say without sounding like he was making excuses for a military failure, was that Alex Reeves had fought them using their own infrastructure as a weapon. He'd turned a mining colony into a fortress, civilian equipment into military assets, and their own tactical doctrine into a psychological weapon. It wasn't just impressive. It was terrifying. Admiral, said another official, what are your recommendations for future encounters with similar threats? Klekstar looked at the assembled faces on his screen, all of them representing military traditions that stretched back millennia. All of them trying to understand how their combined forces had been outmaneuvered by one human with access to spare parts and an engineering manual. Don't send 50 ships to capture one human, he said finally. Excuse me? Marshal, with respect, our entire approach was flawed from the beginning. We deployed overwhelming force against a target that was never going to respond to overwhelming force. We followed established protocols against an opponent who was specifically counting on us to follow established protocols. We tried to fight a conventional military engagement against someone who was never going to fight conventionally. He paused, trying to find words for something that he was only beginning to understand himself. Humans don't think like we do. They don't approach problems the way we approach problems. And if we keep assuming that they're going to follow the same strategic logic that governs our military doctrines, they're going to keep finding ways to turn our advantages into weaknesses. And your recommendation? Next time, send 1 ship, maybe 2. Keep it simple, keep it small, and don't give them infrastructure to work with. Fleet Marshal Corinth was quiet for a long moment, her geometric features shifting through what might have been calculation or contemplation. Admiral, you're relieved of active duty pending a full strategic review. Your tactical analysis will be forwarded to our intelligence services for evaluation. Understood, Marshal. The connection terminated, leaving Klekstar alone with his thoughts and his 17-page incident report that would probably end up being classified at a level so high that even the people who classified it wouldn't be allowed to read it. He leaned back in his chair and tried to imagine what would happen the next time someone encountered Alex Reeves, or someone like him. The thought was not comforting. Meanwhile, 6 light hours away, The Terran Coalition listening post designated Sierra 7 was not, technically speaking, supposed to exist. It was a small installation built into an asteroid in an unnamed system, staffed by 3 intelligence analysts, 2 communications specialists, and 1 very bored maintenance technician who spent most of his time trying to keep the atmospheric recyclers from developing an attitude. When Alex Reeves's mining pod appeared on their sensors, the station went from routine monitoring to general alarm in approximately 15 seconds.
Sir, called Lieutenant Rivera from the communications console. We've got an incoming transmission. It's Alex Reeves.
Commander Park looked up from her morning briefing with the kind of expression that suggested her day had just become significantly more complicated. Alex Reeves was supposed to be either dead or imprisoned somewhere in Zephyrian space, not broadcasting from a stolen mining pod. Put him through. Commander Park, this is Alex Reeves requesting emergency docking and priority intelligence transfer. I have information regarding Zephyrian fleet dispositions, tactical doctrine, and infrastructure vulnerabilities that Command is going to want to see immediately.
Alex, what's your status? Our last intelligence reports had you listed as KIA.
Greatly exaggerated as usual. I've spent the last 3 weeks as a guest of the Zephyrian 7th Fleet.
Educational experience.
I'm transmitting my preliminary report now, but the short version is that we've been significantly overestimating their tactical flexibility. Commander Park watched as data began flowing across her screens. Technical specifications, command structures, and what appeared to be a complete analysis of a major fleet engagement that had apparently involved 50 enemy warships and had somehow ended with Alex escaping in a mining pod. Alex, according to this data, you convinced an entire fleet to retreat by threatening to blow up an asteroid with mining equipment? That's roughly accurate. The important thing is that they believed it was possible, which tells us something significant about their tactical psychology.
Which is, they think like us, but they don't think like humans.
They approach warfare as an extension of their natural social behaviors.
We approach warfare as an engineering problem that happens to involve shooting people.
Commander Park read through the tactical summary, trying to process what she was seeing. According to Alex's report, he'd identified 17 different ways to turn civilian infrastructure into military assets, using nothing but standard maintenance equipment and basic physics. He'd cataloged the psychological profiles of 6 different species' military doctrines, and had apparently figured out how to use their own training against them. Alex, how much of this intelligence represents new capabilities versus techniques that we already have? About 60-40, with the 60 being stuff that any competent engineer could figure out if they had enough time and motivation. The real intelligence value is in understanding how they respond to unconventional tactics.
And how do they respond? Predictably.
That's their weakness, Commander. They're very good at what they do. But they're only good at what they do. Show them something outside their operational parameters, and they default to standard responses even when the standard responses don't make sense. Commander Park stared at the data streaming across her console, and began to understand why Alex's escape had required 50 ships, and had ended with a complete fleet withdrawal.
Dock with Bay 2, Alex. Intelligence is going to want to debrief you immediately.
Copy that. Commander, there's one more thing in my report that you should probably mention to Command. What's that? This isn't going to be the last time something like this happens. The Zephyrians are going to adapt their tactics based on this encounter, but they're going to adapt them in predictable ways. And if Command is smart, we can use that predictability to our advantage. How? By making sure that the next time they encounter human military assets, they're expecting Alex Reeves. But they get someone else entirely. Commander Park smiled. It wasn't a particularly nice smile, but then again, she wasn't feeling particularly nice. Alex, I think Command is going to be very interested in your recommendations. 6 months later, the Zephyrian Third Fleet approached the contested system of Kepler 438, with what their tactical manuals described as appropriate caution. Intelligence reports suggested that human forces were operating in the area, and after the incident at Paradise Mining Colony, the High Command had issued new protocols for dealing with human military assets.
Protocol 1. Assume unconventional tactics. Protocol 2. Maintain simplified operational parameters.
Protocol 3. Under no circumstances deploy more than 10 vessels against individual human targets. Admiral Vex Tai, Klextar's replacement, studied the tactical display with the kind of careful attention that suggested he'd read the classified reports about Alex Reeves and had no intention of becoming the next admiral to be early retired due to tactical innovation by hostile forces. "Sensor sweep complete, Admiral," reported his tactical officer. "We're detecting 1 human vessel, frigate class, holding position near the 4th planet. 1 ship?" "Yes, sir. Standard Terran Coalition configuration, minimal armament, no apparent modifications."
Admiral Vextai considered his options. One ship should be manageable. His fleet consisted of 12 vessels, including 2 heavy cruisers and a carrier. Overwhelming force, but not so overwhelming that they couldn't retreat quickly if the situation became non-standard. Open communications with the human vessel. Channel open, sir. This is Admiral Vextai of the Zephyrian Third Fleet. Human vessel, you are ordered to surrender immediately and prepare to be boarded. The response came back immediately, in accented but clear Zephyrian. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Terran Coalition vessel Defiant. Admiral, I'm afraid I'm going to have to decline your offer. Vextai felt his exoskeleton begin to itch, which was not a good sign. Captain, you are outnumbered 12 to 1. Surrender is your only viable option. Admiral, with respect, I don't think you've thought this through. See, the thing about being outnumbered 12 to 1 is that it means you have 12 ships worth of systems that can malfunction, 12 crews that can be confused, and 12 different opportunities for something to go wrong in spectacular ways. Admiral Vextai stared at his communications console and began to understand that the Alex Reeves incident had not been an isolated occurrence. Captain, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Admiral. I'm just pointing out that you have approximately 15 minutes before this entire system becomes significantly less hospitable to large military formations. Explain. Well, you've probably noticed that this system's star is a variable type G2 with irregular solar flare activity. What you probably haven't noticed is that I've been here for 3 weeks, mapping the magnetic field fluctuations and calculating the optimal resonance frequencies for inducing large-scale electromagnetic cascades. The tactical display began showing new readings, solar activity measurements that hadn't been there before, electromagnetic field data that suggested things were happening that definitely weren't in any of their tactical manuals. Captain, are you claiming that you can somehow weaponize a star? Admiral, I'm not claiming anything. I'm just mentioning that in about 14 minutes, this system is going to experience a solar flare event that will disrupt communications, navigation, and weapons systems for any vessel within approximately 50 million kilometers of the star's corona. Vextai looked at the tactical display, which was now showing his fleet's position relative to the star and what appeared to be a countdown timer that was definitely not supposed to be there. Captain, that's impossible. Solar flares are natural phenomena. They cannot be artificially induced. You're absolutely right, Admiral. They're completely natural. It's just that sometimes, if you understand the underlying magnetic field interactions, and you have access to the right kind of resonance equipment, you can encourage them to happen at more convenient times. The countdown timer read 1347, 1346, 1345. Admiral Vextai closed his eyes and tried to remember why he'd ever thought that replacing Admiral Kleckstar was a good career move. All ships, he announced, emergency withdrawal. Set course for the outer system, maximum velocity. As the Zephyrian Third Fleet began its strategic withdrawal from one human frigate, and what might or might not have been an artificially induced solar flare, Captain Elena Vasquez settled back in her command chair and began composing her after-action report. The report would note that she had successfully defended the Kepler 438 system, using a combination of astrophysical knowledge, electromagnetic theory, and what she'd like to call creative intimidation. It would also note that the Zephyrians had retreated exactly as Command had predicted they would, following their new protocols for dealing with human forces in a way that was both logical and completely predictable. What the report wouldn't mention was that there had never been any plan to artificially induce a solar flare, because that was impossible using anything short of stellar-level engineering capabilities that no one in the galaxy actually possessed. The countdown timer had been displaying the estimated time until the system's star entered its normal, naturally occurring, completely predictable solar maximum phase that Elena had been monitoring for 3 weeks, and that presented absolutely no danger to properly shielded military vessels. But Admiral Vextai hadn't known that. And because he'd been briefed on the Alex Reeves incident, he'd been expecting unconventional tactics, impossible engineering, and threats that existed primarily in the tactical imagination of humans, who had apparently figured out how to weaponize other people's expectations. Elena smiled and began calculating jump coordinates for her next assignment. Command had a whole list of contested systems that could benefit from some creative problem-solving. After all, the galaxy was a big place, full of military forces who were very good at fighting conventional wars against conventional opponents using conventional tactics. It was going to be educational. Final entry. The new doctrine, from the classified files of the Terran Coalition. Strategic Command. Subject: Human Military Doctrine. Tactical Assessment and Recommendations. Classification Level. Cosmic. Author: Admiral Sarah Chen, Strategic Analysis Division. The recent encounters between human forces and various alien military coalitions have demonstrated capabilities that require immediate doctrinal adjustment. Analysis of the Reeves incident, the Vasquez maneuver, and 17 similar engagements over the past 6 months indicates that human military assets are achieving tactical success rates that significantly exceed statistical expectations. This success is not due to superior technology, numerical advantage, or conventional military strength. Instead, it appears to be the result of a fundamental difference in how humans approach warfare compared to other galactic civilizations. Key findings. Tactical unpredictability. Human forces consistently employ solutions that fall outside the operational parameters expected by enemy commanders. This is not due to random behavior, but rather to a systematic approach that treats warfare as an engineering problem, rather than a social phenomenon. Infrastructure weaponization. Human personnel demonstrate an exceptional ability to convert civilian systems into military assets, using improvised modifications and unconventional applications of basic technology. Psychological warfare. Humans appear to intuitively understand that the most effective weapon against technologically superior forces is the enemy's own assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. Adaptive problem solving. When faced with overwhelming odds, human personnel tend to redefine the problem rather than attempt to solve it within existing parameters. Tactical implications. The evidence suggests that human military doctrine has evolved in response to our species' unique combination of creativity, technical adaptability, and what psychologists term constructive paranoia, the ability to identify potential threats and opportunities that others might overlook. This has resulted in military personnel who are trained not just to fight, but to think. Not just to follow orders, but to rewrite the rules when the situation demands it. Recommendations. Expand unconventional warfare training across all branches of the military. Implement cross-disciplinary education programs, combining military strategy with engineering, psychology, and astrophysics. Develop tactical scenarios specifically designed to encourage creative problem-solving under pressure. Establish rapid response teams composed of personnel with diverse technical backgrounds. Conclusion. The galaxy is full of species that evolved to be warriors, diplomats, strategists, and engineers. Humans evolved to be survivors. In a military context, this has proven to be a significant advantage. Our enemies are learning to expect the unexpected from human forces. Our response should be to become even more unexpected. The universe is a dangerous place, full of civilizations with technology and numerical advantages that we cannot match through conventional means. But conventional means have never been humanity's strong suit. Time to remind the galaxy why that might not be such a disadvantage after all. End report. File sealed under authorization code, Terra Prime 7. Distribution. Need to know. Basis only. Next review. Date. Classified. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, on ships both human and alien, military officers read reports and tactical analyses and tried to understand how a species that had barely achieved faster-than-light travel was somehow rewriting the rules of galactic warfare, using nothing more than creativity, stubbornness, and an apparently pathological refusal to accept that something couldn't be done just because it had never been done before. The humans, for their part, were just getting started. After all, they'd spent their entire evolutionary history on a planet that was actively trying to kill them, developing technology in spite of governments that were often working at cross purposes, and generally surviving in an environment where the correct response to, "That's impossible," was usually, "Hold my beer and watch this." The galaxy, it turned out, was not prepared for that level of creative problem-solving applied to military strategy. But they were learning, the hard way. Thus ends the tale of how 50 ships were sent to capture one human and lost them all. Not to superior firepower or advanced technology, but to the simple human habit of looking at problems from angles that no one else had ever thought to consider. The galaxy would never be quite the same. And frankly, that was probably for the best. The end.